Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Always good to be here.
Matt, a couple of weeks ago, we had, I thought, a pretty significant announcement from our friends at COSO, and it is a draft corporate governance framework. And you have written about this, so I thought maybe we could explore your blog post and the framework and see how it may apply, certainly to corporate governance, but maybe compliance, and where we might be able to take this down the road.
Yeah, sure. So I let the record show I'm a big fan of COSO and the frameworks and guidance it puts out. And they had been working on this framework for corporate governance for a while, I think at least a year or so. And they finally now have put out this draft exposure document for the public. And it is open for public comment through July 11. If you want to see a copy of it yourself and submit comments, I think you can go just to coso.org, COSO, coso.org. You'll be able to download the summary. It's for free. Take a look at it. We don't know, for the record, what the final version of this framework might look like. We don't know exactly when that final framework will arrive. I am willing to bet certainly within a year, maybe even by the end of this year, but I'm not sure. But nonetheless, this framework right now, I think even in the draft form, is still really useful. Corporate governance is one of those things we talk about all the time, and yet it is somewhat difficult to pin down exactly what you mean by governance. And we always say good governance is important. What would that entail? And what's the discipline that you would need to bring to good governance so that your organization, whatever it's doing, whatever industry, public, private, nonprofit, or otherwise, how big or small, how could you assure that organization is structured the right way and doing the right things to try to advance on its mission and objectives? That's what the framework is there to do. People have asked for one for a long time, and COSO is a lot of other smaller frameworks on more specific things, but now we have at least a draft of this framework for the biggest of the big things.
So, Matt, the first thing I noticed about this framework was it had 6 objectives rather than 5. So I was wondering if we may be able to start with that, and then, of course, we'll cascade down to the principles and points of focus as appropriate. But what do you see in the big 6 objectives?
Yeah, like all frameworks, it would not be a COSO document without some really arresting, colorful image trying to capture what they mean here. So they did divide it up into 6 components, I guess, and they're structured in a circle. So I guess it would look, I don't know, one of those Simon Says games from way back when with 6 colors instead of 4. But I thought that you could carve up these 6 components into 2 sets of 3. The first 3 are, well, let me see, now they're out of order now that I'm looking at the image. They're like the first 3 are what I would say are big strategic elements, such as oversight of the organization, setting strategy, and setting the corporate culture of the organization. Now, those are all important, but those are big things that senior management does with the board. And then there are 3 more that I think are a bit more tactical in their nature. The people, how you bring together the right human resources to be able to do whatever it is your organization does, how to structure the right communications channels. A lot of that is about how to engage different audiences and stakeholders. Resilience is the 6th one. And that gets right down to the nitty gritty of developing a system of internal control, managing risks, managing compliance responsibilities and whatnot. You can arrange all of those in a circle. COSO does. At the smack middle of the circle, I guess maybe it's like a donut now that I'm staring at it, is supposedly in the middle of the donut is long-term value of the organization. So if you've got everything spinning the right way, it's going to enhance long-term value for all of your stakeholders over the long term, whether that is shareholders, other stakeholders, the board, and then employees and whatnot. They're all groups that work within these 6 components to advance long-term value. That's the image right now. I have seen frameworks from COSO in the past where their preliminary image is very different from the final image. I kind of like this donut thing, but we'll see what it looks like. But those are the 6 components.
So, Matt, in your blog post, you focused a little extra time on culture and why that was so important to the compliance professional. Why do you think culture is so significant in this framework and for the compliance professional?
It's important because the Justice Department has said it's important time and time again. They talk about a culture of compliance, and that is a part and parcel of the guidelines the department has for an effective compliance program. I think one of the exact questions, if I remember correctly, is how and how often does the company measure its culture of compliance? That's one criteria that the prosecutors might use to evaluate your compliance program. Clearly, you can't ignore culture, and really, you're not going to have a good compliance program without a strong culture, because culture is all about, I think, getting people invested in what the organization is doing. Their head is in the game, they understand how they're supposed to behave, and they all move essentially in unison. I get it in practice. Unison is a pretty fuzzy concept, but basically you want everybody keeping their eye on the same ball. That's why culture is so important. But Tom, what I really did like about this framework is that each element, each component, first has a couple of principles underneath it that you should be following to make sure that component is working well. And then within each of those principles are several even more specific points of focus. So I'll get back to culture in a minute, but in total, then we have these 6 big components that are undergirded by a total of, I think, 24 it is, principles, and then dozens and dozens of points of focus underneath the 24 principles. This is a big framework. This is convoluted and complex, and maybe it'll be simplified in the final version. But anyways, getting back to culture. So, okay, that's a component. We should have it. What does that mean? Well, COSO has proposed 3 principles to help you understand how to manage your culture. Number 1, establish and model culture and behaviors. Number 2, promote ethics, respect, and open communications. Number 3, assess and adapt the culture. Now, those are the 3 principles, and then you might say, okay, sounds great. How actually do I do that? If you dove into the complete draft framework, you'd find not quite a dozen points of focus to support those 3 principles. Now, each level you get more and more specific. But Tom, I think you could even do something as simple as take those 3 principles and then convert them into a risk control matrix of some kind. I took some of the principles for a different component on governance, and I just asked ChatGPT, can you come up with a risk control framework for oversight, of the oversight component? And it did. And it would identify the risks. Okay, these are the risks for each principle. What were some of the controls or practices you could embed? Who actually would be executing those? How often do you execute those practices or controls? I have a sample of it up on my blog post, but you could choose your own adventure here at home, either with a control framework you have already or some sort of a tool, AI or otherwise, to help you conjure up a risk and control matrix for each of these components. But you can really start to see, all right, these are nifty ideas, but what am I supposed to do? There's a lot of ways you can take the nifty ideas and come up with more specific steps that you could then start to do at your company. You can explain all of that to senior management. Here's how we're going to support our culture of compliance according to that framework. Here's how often we're going to do it. Then you could do it. Then you could come up with a report that you might give to the board at a meeting once a year or something about the state of the corporate culture. You could do this in conjunction with HR, making sure that your vision of a culture is in step with their vision of the culture. You could take the framework, you could ask internal audit, why don't you do tests to make sure that what we're doing that's actually copacetic with what you think the risks for culture are. And this is all just right now with this formative draft. The final version might still look very different, but this draft is hitting on all the important elements of a successful, well-governed organization. And you can even just take that and from there start to flesh out in more and more detail each level down. What would I really be doing to achieve strong governance at my company? And I'll stop there, but there's a lot.
So I really like thinking through an analysis with the framework you have outlined. I did a similar exercise with the COSO Internal Controls Framework in 2013, where I listed all 5 objectives, 70 principles, and 84 points of focus up against the then 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program. I expanded it to 11 when
Mhm.
the root cause analysis. And in addition to pointing out to you gaps you might have, the flip side of that is you may be doing a lot of this and not considering it a control. So, for instance, establish and model culture and behaviors. You specifically called out HR. I would suggest that if HR could say a few words about culture or say a few words about compliance on an initial interview or an onboarding interview or an interview where senior managers or someone went up the chain in terms of interviews, senior managers could talk about culture and the importance of doing business ethically and in compliance. That all of those points could then be identified so that you could demonstrate to an auditor, to a stakeholder, to a regulator, you have a documented framework of controls that you are utilizing for your corporate governance and your compliance program throughout. So you might find that you're actually doing a lot more of these things than you thought it so, because you never thought of it as a control. And each one of those, then you can go in to fill in the gaps.
I think that is spot on. I suspect a lot of compliance and audit people, as you look at this framework, you might realize you're actually doing a lot of governance stuff, or a lot of governance stuff is happening within your enterprise, and you don't necessarily know that. But this framework is all about being able to find those pockets of governance activities, bring them all together, and structure them in a more disciplined way. I absolutely agree with you, Tom. I think it's a great idea to say, look at some of what this framework offers and its principles and see if you could align them with the hallmarks of an effective compliance program. And you probably can. And you can probably then pull together documentation and evidence underneath that. So if you do have an enforcement action and you are talking to a prosecutor about the state of your culture, you could very easily see, this is where the evidence we have, this is what we've been doing, this is where we needed more work and how we're beefing up that work. But here, prosecutor, is the evidence that you want to see of where we are, where we think we need to improve, and what evidence we have to make that contention, that statement. You could do that. You could also run this exercise just to demonstrate that you're well governed, to show it for, say, institutional investors who might be looking to make a large investment in your company, but want to make sure that they are not throwing money down a rat hole. Investor, private equity fund, VC fund, whoever, here is our approach to governance. Here's why we think it works. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're doing great. Here's what we're still working on to make sure it will be great within the next year or two. But it's all about illuminating what you're actually doing right now, how much it is or isn't in step with good governance principles. And then you can get yourself on a path to bringing up the weak areas or making sure that the strong areas stay strong. Tom, if I can dork out on one particular principle I really liked, it was in the communications component, Principle 17, commitment to information quality. Think about that. This is going to become hugely important in the future in our IT, AI saturated world, that it's all based on valid data, strong information quality. So you don't have to worry about data validation or improperly sourced data that you shouldn't have had access to or anything like that. And this exercise will force you or your internal auditor or your cybersecurity people, or probably all 3 or 4 of you, how do you equip your business functions to meet the data management requirements that they're going to have? How will they make sure that the AI that they're using is grounded in good data, and it's data you're allowed to use, and therefore the data it's generating is also going to be reliable? How would you know that? How are you going to test it? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to see if there's model drift over time? Those are all questions that flow from the principle of a commitment to information quality. And if you sort all that out, suddenly it gets much easier to figure out, what IT investments do we want to make? What are we going to tell that regulator who's knocking on the door after a data breach? What are we going to tell our customers who are curious about our own cybersecurity posture? and where our posture comes from. You'd be able to point to it. And it's principles like that help to clarify and focus what you're doing. So I really do like this framework, even in this early draft stage. And if they come up with a very different final framework in 6 months, Tom, we'll have to do another podcast. But it's a great tool right now.
Let me go to the objective of resilience, because that's not a specific objective we have previously seen called out in a COSO framework, although I think much of it was embedded in many of the other objectives we looked at, specifically the internal controls framework. Did you see anything different or new in the resilience, or is it just a recognition that moving from disaster recovery to business as usual is where we are now?
I think it's a lot of that. I would define resilience as the ability to keep providing essential business services even amid the disruption, whatever the disruption is. Might be a cyber attack, might be a weather disaster, might be the sudden loss of a supplier, might be a pandemic. Stuff happens. And historically, stuff would happen in such a small and contained way that a part of your enterprise might go through some painful ordeal, but a large part of it would be okay. Now, in modern times, that is no longer true. I think one great example of that would be that CrowdStrike IT outage from last year. CrowdStrike pushed out a bad IT update to its business customers who implemented it, and it crashed their systems. And there were airlines that couldn't get their flights reserved and rescheduled and back up off the ground for days. That is not a resilient enterprise. That is an enterprise with a terribly weak point of failure. And even though there was nothing nefarious here, CrowdStrike just had a coding error, it exposed that point of failure for some of the largest airlines in the world. That's not going to be tenable in the future. We are only going to be more dependent on IT systems, only going to be more interdependent with other parties. So how are you going to be able to assure that when the bad thing happens that causes a big disruption, you're still able to provide some basic modicum of services even during that chaos time while the business continuity plan kicks back up into motion and kind of get yourself back up off your feet? That's really what resilience is going to be about. I'm glad that they've identified that as an important component. I hope it stays into the final draft. And when I make a comment to COSO, I'll include that. But it's the sort of thing that I think companies knew at an instinctive level that, okay, stuff happens. We're still going to have to do work. But we haven't been able to think it through in a disciplined way about how will we do that. And now COSO is proposing some ways to get yourself to think and to pledge your sacred honor to figure out how you're going to do it.
And I know you have already stated this in the pod, but I'd like to put it in one place for our listeners. What is the comment period? When does the comment period end? And why do you think it's important that all manner of practitioners comment on this framework?
So yes, you can go to coso.org to download a copy of the draft framework. You can submit comments. If memory serves, they even have some sample ideas of here's the stuff we're looking to hear from people who are interested in the framework. But certainly, I think COSO is open to any comments at all. It is open for public comment until July 11. I don't actually think if you submit something on July 12th, they're immediately going to turn it away. I'm not sure. I can't speak for COSO, but the more public comment, the better, because they do want to have a good, useful framework for all parties involved. That's going to be the board. That's going to be internal auditors. It's going to be compliance officers and senior managers. Could be institutional investors who want to make sure that their money is going to useful places. And why is it important to comment? It is worth noting that, like I said before, a final version might look substantially different than what we are seeing here. I can remember, I think it was 12 years ago or something, but COSO had proposed an enterprise risk management framework where they came up with a similar sort of image in the draft that was, I called it a donut with a spear running through it for long-term value. They did not appreciate the spear donut metaphor. But ultimately, when they unveiled the final enterprise risk management framework, they had a very different image and a very different organization of all the principles that looked more like a DNA strand. So I don't know what this is actually going to look like. I do think they're hitting on all the important themes, but we could see fewer principles. We could see fewer points of focus. I do know one of the long-running sort of background complaints about the internal audit or internal control framework way back when. It had dozens of points of focus, but auditors started comparing your internal control to each point of focus. Not everybody liked that idea. Personally, I do, because it shows you have a comprehensive approach to internal control, and you should. So I don't know, maybe we'll see fewer points of focus. Maybe we'll see fewer principles. Maybe we'll see different principles arranged in different ways. Maybe we'll see some new ones replacing some that are going to get deleted. I don't know. It really depends on the feedback that COSO gets. But ultimately, I think in the future, the biggest challenge for companies is going to be, do you have the governance to steer everybody in the right direction, even though along the way there's going to be a lot of bumps and twists and turns? That's what governance is. It's steering in a broad direction. We're going to need more help to make sure that you have good governance in place. This is that help. So this is for you, everybody who's listening. So take a look. Tell COSO what you think. They're going to be happy for the feedback.
Man, I was going to call this document useful, but you used a word I'm much more persuaded by. Actually, I was going to call it important, but you used the word useful. And I think that's spot on. This is an incredibly useful document for a wide variety of stakeholders, literally at any level for corporations. So I hope they will take up your clarion call to download it, look at it, comment on it if appropriate, but certainly become familiar with it because it is useful.
Thank you, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.